Hey everybody, welcome to a sermon extra here at Ascension Church of Phoenix. My name is Gray Ewing. I'm the pastor at Ascension Church, and we like to do these sermon extras periodically. It's kind of a low stakes, quick follow-up on something that we talked about on Sunday. Oftentimes on Sunday, I have to leave things on the cutting room floor, things I can't fully explain, or they're just things that I think would be edifying that we don't have time for. And so I like to grab some members of our leadership to talk through some of these issues. And today we actually are blessed to have a roundtable of our elders. And so I'll just have you guys say hi when I say your name so people will know which voice is attached to which person. But we have our ruling elder, Rob Witham. Hello. And we have our ruling elder, Keith Clemenger. Hello. And we have our ruling elder, Guy Weinberg. Hello. And we're all gathered around a table, hunched together, as a subsection of our elders. We have other elders that are not able to be here this morning. And I wanted to follow up with you guys and get your reaction, because I didn't have time on Sunday, before Sunday, to engage with you on the topic of Sabbath, but that was a focus on Sundays. We talked about from Exodus 31. I will briefly just explain what I said about the Sabbath, because after church, we had a number of people come and talk to me, some questions kind of seemingly just inquisitive questions, some more of a challenge. And I think the idea of keeping the Sabbath, which is what we talked about in part on Sunday, is a difficult thing for people to wrestle with, especially when it comes to understanding the Old Covenant and the New Covenant and where Sabbath keeping kind of falls into that. So we were here praying this morning together as elders, and we thought, why don't we just turn on the microphone and get your feedback. I have no idea what these guys are going to say, by the way. So, but they are the leaders of the church as much as I am, and so I want to hear what they have to say and to model for you all how we converse about these things. In brief, on Sunday, I said that the Sabbath principle continues into the New Testament. So when we're talking about the Sabbath is rooted in creation. 6 days God worked, seventh day he rested. The passage that we were reading from Exodus 31 says he rested and was refreshed on the seventh day. Later in Israel's history, the 10 Commandments were given in Exodus 20 and repeated in Deuteronomy 5. And one of those commandments was to remember the Sabbath day. And I made the claim on Sunday that it is the most quoted Old Testament law, is that 10th commandment of keeping the Sabbath. What? Fourth commandment. Yes, the fourth commandment. What did I say? 10. Oh, 10th commandment. Sorry. Thanks, Keith, for clarifying. Of the 10 commandments is what I meant to say. The fourth one is the one that is most often cited. So there is a question, though, as we, because of the penalties associated with the Sabbath. Exodus 31 talks about that as well, that there was a death penalty attached to breaking the Sabbath. We don't know how often that was practiced. We don't know if that was a mandatory thing. It was just a possibility. But clearly God cared about that command in the Old Testament. When it comes to the New Testament, people wonder, does this Sabbath continue? And I made the claim on Sunday that I believe the principle continues, but the penalty has been paid. Meaning, I still think it's appropriate for Christians to say, we keep the Sabbath, but that we do so in a way that's filled with freedom and grace that Jesus has won for us on the cross. So I have no idea what these guys are going to say, but I wanted to just kick it over to you guys. What would you say? Just interact with that. You can, affirm, you can, challenge it. And I'll start off by saying that John Calvin disagreed. The 16th century reformer disagreed with that position. Now, most of his followers disagreed with him on that as well, but he believed that the Sabbath did not continue. And so there is room for diversity in our tradition on this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's like the principle for how you would, understand if a law given in the Mosaic Law is valid for today. I mean, that in one sense is one of the questions. I would say that we have sort of in our tradition, there's this idea of the continuity of the old covenant and the new covenant, meaning if God said something in the old covenant and gave a command, it is still in effect unless God says it's not. And so one example of that would be all the dietary laws that were specifically rescinded in the new covenant with Peter's vision when he was visiting Cornelius, of all the, the animals coming out of the sheep, and God basically said, I am abrogating that. So there's this principle that only God may, if God is the lawgiver, he may also change or alter or put out of gear, is another way to put it. So the sacrificial system is another example that we don't observe that anymore, even though we would recognize it was very good and God gave it. And yet we have in Christ, all that's being fulfilled. So the Sabbath question is kind of in a weird way for me, in between those, I don't see anything in the New Testament, any revelation that would say it's not valid. We did see very early on the Christians' observance of it changed to Sunday because that was when the resurrection of Jesus happened. So almost immediately believers in Jesus began meeting and gathering on Sunday. I mean, there's very strong evidence for that. They understood the Sabbath, the day of rest, the first day of the week, took that over, and the Christians' worship was centered around celebrating the resurrection of Christ. And so there is that. And then I think you could also say that Jesus sort of clarified the observance of the Sabbath and removed a lot of the Pharisaical kind of self-righteous things that were encrusted around it, basically saying the Sabbath is for man, not man for Sabbath. And so there's a lot to that. What does that mean? What are the boundaries there? And there's obviously, I think, work to do with that. But I would say it's valid because it's in God's law. God never said it's not valid. Jesus didn't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. And so there's some changes and there's discussion around that, but that are good and healthy to have. But I would say it's still binding on Christians just as much as the other 9 commandments are. It's something that we're required to do, and it's also for our good. It's not just a duty, but it's a privilege and a delight.
I see it as a difference between a regulation, which is what we had with the Old Testament, where, the Jews would be put to death if they violated the Sabbath, as we saw in the Exodus 31 passage, and a principle. The principle of rest, the principle of putting aside those things that are of the world that we do normally for our maintenance is a good principle, and give that time to God is a good principle, and it's helpful to us if we do that.
Would you say it's a lawful principle?
Well, it's a good principle because it's as we read in the Hebrews passage that we looked at. Rest is good. God gives us that rest, and as God rested on the seventh day, so it is good for us to rest and put our minds and our hearts on things that are different than we're engaged with during the rest of the week. But it's no longer a regulation. It's no longer where the church goes out and so if I can find somebody that's reading a paper for work on Sunday, you violated the Sabbath and therefore we're going to put you to death. It's not that, but it's still a principle that we should aspire to. I think it's good for us as individual Christians. I think it's good for our families. I think it's good for the church as a community to look at the Sabbath day as a day that's different than the rest. But it's no longer a regulation. It's a principle that's vital to us, that's helpful to us, and that we should aspire to keep.
I think for me, just one last thing to underline is that Jesus did say that he was Lord of the Sabbath, and that Sabbath was for man, not man for the Sabbath. That to me sorts out a lot of this, at least in practical terms. And it's helpful because if that wasn't there, I think I would be very confused. I wouldn't know how I could think about it. But when I can say, okay, this is where Jesus stood on it. And there's lots of examples in the Gospels of where he talked with people about that. At least then I have some idea, okay, if I'm trying to figure out what do I do on the Sabbath, then Jesus has some commentary there that's very clear and very specific and practical. So that's just one thing to add to all of this.
I think Jesus, it's similar to what he does in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's not changing the law of God.
That's right.
He's explaining the intent, the original intent behind it. And so what had happened with the Sabbath, much like many other things, is that there was all this basically Talmudic interpretation over many centuries that had created all these very specific rules about, I mean, you can think of today like kosher settings on an oven, right? Like there's just weird ways that people create that we do in our hearts to try to obey or not obey. And it's like, that was never God's intent for the Sabbath, it was. And so Jesus comes and kind of clears the table, but it's not as though, in my opinion, he's not saying something really new. He's trying to bring us back to what was always the intent. But from the beginning, because God's law is gracious. That's where I think sometimes Christians go wrong. They think like, well, Jesus was just doing something so radically different. Well, no, how could that be? Like, he's the Son, and the Father gave the law, and like they're one and they don't change. So how could those iterations be so different?
I think, Rob, you bring up a good point. What we see from the regulation from the Old Testament, by the time we get to Jesus' time and the Pharisees, they had turned that regulation into something where it was a badge that they could wear. Here are all the things you need to not do on the Sabbath, and here's all you need to do on the Sabbath. And let me show you how I've ticked every box and how I'm better than you because I've done that. Jesus was one who said, you're not getting it. You don't understand what the Sabbath was created for. That's not the purpose of it. And I think that's where we stand today. It's not ticking the box and saying, God, look how good I am because I'm doing all these things or I'm refraining from these things. It is really, I recognize treating one day of the week differently because of my relationship with you, because of my love for you, and because of my need for a rest that you've set aside for me, that's a good thing, and that we should be doing that ourselves, and we should be helping our family and the community of our church understand the benefit of that.
Sounds like there's a lot of agreement, about the practice of the principle of it continuing. Just to, if somebody's listening in a disagreeing position, let me steel man their argument, right? Because there is Colossians 2. I noticed nobody threw this in my face here, but there is, therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. And most Baptist theologians, for instance, even Reformed Baptists, would take this passage and say that is part of the shadows. They would actually say, to your point, Rob, that it is like the dietary laws that Christ fulfilled, and therefore it does belong in that category. And Paul in Colossians 2, would seem to be saying that. My understanding of this passage, just by the way, there's two different understandings of what, if you hold my position, what this would be. Some would say, well, this is more of the Sabbath feast days, because it's included in the list of festivals, rather than the principle of the Sabbath. And that has some merit to it. It's not clear. It does say Sabbath day in the passage. But what I see this passage as saying is a little different. I see it, the focus being on not letting other people judge you in these things. So not that these things are bad enough themselves, or that necessarily we even stop doing it. We still have festival days in a sense, right, as Christians, but we don't let people judge us in regard to those. So if someone doesn't want to participate in a Easter Sunday as an Easter Sunday, for instance, that for us is a festival, I would say it's fine for you not to practice quote unquote Easter if you believe that, the resurrection should be celebrated every Sunday, or Good Friday, or Ash Wednesday, or whatever it is. We don't have judgments in regard to that. And in the same way, I think Christians should be super careful about saying you can't do that on the Sabbath, right? That's how I understand what Paul's saying here. It seems to me an odd conclusion to draw that 9 of the 10 commandments continue and then one of them doesn't. If we think of the 10 commandments and we all say lying is a sin, right? Bearing false witness, having some other God other than the Lord your God as your God, would all be law still for Christians. Now, we're not saved by following the law, right? But the law continues as a reflection of God's heart. In my mind, just cut off the Sabbath from that would be, and to use this passage to do that would basically just go and fly in the face of any kind of, faithful biblical interpretation of the rest of the scriptures. Any quick things you'd want to add on to the theological discussion
Well, I think that they demonstrate what is good for us and right for all 10 commandments continue to demonstrate what God's best is for us. And in the case of Sabbath, it is not that he needs us to do that for the Sabbath, but it benefits us by recognizing the Sabbath as a special day and accepting that rest at that time. Doesn't make us any better, but it provides betterment to us by us recognizing that.
I think that we can all agree, no matter if you're listening to this, wherever you're listening, rest is a biblical principle that continues in the New Testament. Worship, continuing to meet together, as Hebrews tells us regularly, not neglecting the gathering together of worship, continues in the New Testament. So there are commands, even if we wanted to arrive at a Sabbath principle without saying the Sabbath word. If you're in that position, then you can worship freely with us and also rest well. There's just, if you call it the Sabbath or you call it the Lord's Day, that's okay, right? We're just kind of describing how I think the Sabbath ideas continues on. But I'll give you guys the final word. What would be something that you would encourage people to think about in terms of keeping the Sabbath? If we're going to go with keeping the Sabbath as a principle that God's people are called to do, with New Testament, with gospel grace, intentionality, yes, but also just tons of freedom. Clearly, Jesus did not hound people for, he let his disciples gather grain on Sundays and on the Sabbath day, I'm sorry. How would you, with freedom and intentionality, encourage people, just something that's worked for you, or just as a pastoral word to those who are wanting to Sabbath more?
Well, I would kind of like your point about like we keep all the other 9, but for some weird reason the Sabbath kind of gets put in it, and there may be scriptural and theological reasons for that too that I wouldn't begrudge people, but I do think it should be looked at with the same level of like sobriety and weight as all of the 10 commandments. I mean, in some sense, and so I don't love when we sort of say, well, it's not, just do it however you want to do it. It's like, well, there's an element of, there's clearly freedom in that. And yet at the same time, it's the force of like, God chose to put it on the first tablet of the law. And it was very important. And so I think for me, and like kind of early on in our family, when we started trying to recognize what role that would play in our culture of our home, just feeling the good weight of, okay, God wants us to do this. It's not just up to me to kind of, do whatever I want. It's like, no, this is a serious thing. And then many Christians over millennia have sort of paved the way in how we view this and how we celebrate it. And it has real cultural ramifications, both in your home and in society, I think, for how Christians will observe this, because it is very countercultural in a good way. And so I think having the weight of that recognized, and this is one of the 10 commandments in some sense, just as important as thou shalt not murder. God put it in the same list. And then there's a lot of work to do to flesh that out and be faithful to what God's actually calling us to in the Sabbath. But sort of start with the idea that this is very important to God. And it is, while it is a gracious delight, it is also a duty, and not being afraid of that, so like many duties, all duties that we have that are from the Lord should be a delight, in the same way, like my duty to my wife should be a delight to be faithful. And so part of that, just not being kind of learning to hold that language of duty in a way that doesn't become self-righteous, but that receives like the goodness of that. There's like a weight from God to us in celebrating this. And then I think families and churches have to do the work of sort of fleshing out. To me, like in all the 10 commandments, this one has the most to do with culture in a way. Like everything that goes into work to rest and worship has to do with food. It has to do with the way you structure your home. It has to do with how you unwind. I mean, it's very powerful. And I think it's worthy of a lot of thought, home to home and within churches, of how do we do this really well before the Lord, because it can have just a really good long-term impact on people.
I agree with what Rob said, but thinking of it very pragmatically, there are things that are beneficial to us as believers, worshiping together, reading the Bible, praying, visiting the sick, encouraging others, having time with our family, where we always say, if I only had time, I'd do this, but I never have time. The idea of the Sabbath is to say, well, wait, 1/7 of all the time I have, I can make time for that if it's a priority in my life. So speaking of it pragmatically, it's a way that we as Christians can say, I will worship, I will pray, I will read the Bible, I will spend time with my family, I will visit the sick, I will encourage others on the Sabbath, as I will other days of the week as well. But it'll give me one day where I've set it aside and I'm saying, I'm dedicating that to you.
It's interesting, the connection, Rob, that you made between the Old Testament law and the Sermon on the Mount, and how Jesus interprets the law in new ways. It's the same law. In fact, it's deeper and it's clearer. And if we try to think in terms of the Sabbath like that, then there's more freedom in the way Jesus deals with the Sabbath than any of his contemporaries. But also, you realize that Jesus' life was characterized by this deep love and following of his Father's will. And the Sabbath, in a way, is something where we can, even with all the busyness of our lives, we can say, okay, every seventh day, I can take time to do this intentionally in ways that I might not be able to the rest of the week. And it starts to become a habit. It's like a spiritual discipline, if you like. But it's something where if we build that into our lives, it's a design that God has there for our good. Like in the Sermon on the Mount, it talks about the Beatitudes. You're blessed if you do these things. Well, the Sabbath is like that. At least it ought to be, where as we do it, it's a good thing.
Thank you, guys. We'll leave it there. And thank you all three for contributing to that. I thought it was a great discussion. And Ascension Church, we love you. And if you have questions, you can always follow up with any pastor or your parish elder if you have questions about how the Sabbath should work out in your life. So see you on Sunday.
Thanks again for listening. To access more resources for your walk with Christ, please visit us at ascensionphx.org.